Honorable President Kenyatta, first of all, congratulations with your birthday. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Chairman of the Global Center on Adaptation, thank you for your remarkable leadership. The Vice Chancellor, Honorable Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, but particularly students, welcome. We are living inside the eye of the storm. My name is Verkooijen. I'm indeed the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. The climate emergency has Africa at the crossroads. Business as usual is a surefire route to chaos, but adapt to it and Africa will thrive. That is why I've come to Nairobi today to deliver this first inaugural annual lecture of the GCA. I was last in Kenya 10 years ago, and it is good to be back. I was supporting a climate-smart agriculture project in Kisumu with 60,000 smallholder farmers. And I met a farmer there, Anne Akinji. She was involved in the program, like many others, which combined traditional agriculture processes with a new focus on tree planting, intercropping, mulching, and the new part, sequestering carbon. These approaches were clearly yielding a triple dividend. Agriculture productivity doubled, the resilience of farmers became much higher, and agriculture became part of the climate solution. Anne was joined by 60,000 other smallholder farmers. But what the program really lacked, what it lacked was scale. Imagine this program across the whole of Africa. That would be real adaptation in action. Quite frankly, we don't need to learn how to adapt. We are already doing it, but what we need to do, what we have as a problem is the problem of speed and the problem of scale. Adaptation is far too piecemeal and way too slow. We need more ambition, which is entirely possible. At Paris, a few years ago, we had emission commitments on the table that had us headed for more than 3 degrees of climate chaos. 6 years on, the combined pledges of the world's economies have us closer to 2 degrees. But we have to keep strengthening them to hold the line to 1.5 degrees. We need the same level of ambition for adaptation. But don't forget, we have even less time. The IPCC just confirmed we will enter the 1.5 degrees world in 2030. Certain impacts like extreme heat spells will double by then, and the urgency to respond will be nowhere greater than here in Africa. For accelerated adaptation to be a reality here, we need the financing to work. But I'm here to tell you that we can do that too. The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, don't forget this, Africa Adaptation Program, AAAP, is already a $25 billion initiative. We need to deliver it and build it up and set in motion bold financing in parallel. But $25 billion over 5 years is still a drop in the ocean. Compared to the challenges we face, this is the floor, not the ceiling for adaptation finance. It's the floor, not the ceiling. Most disasters in Africa are flood related, we know that. But drought has by far the greatest impact, affecting 5 times the number of people. Last year, more than 1 in 5 people here in Africa faced hunger. Given how we know this climate crisis is evolving, that is a very alarming stat. But again, this is not the full story. For us at the Global Center on Adaptation, the GCA, the real story of climate change in Africa is a story of resilience, of solidarity, of opportunities for a safer, greener, more prosperous continent. It is this story. The solutions and the innovation, the hard facts of science, and the leadership of communities, the need for coordinated action, and the urgent call for more and smarter financing. This is the story we capture in the State and Trends Report 2021, the report we're launching today. And this is the report we're launching, and I hope that all of you will have a chance to read this. A report which was prepared with leading institutions and researchers from Africa and the world, including this university. A report that reviews the many sectors and economic activities impacted by climate change. But equally, a report that focuses on solutions and action. And as we were preparing the report, we interviewed youth, small entrepreneurs around Africa on climate change. And we were all impressed by their stories of resilience. The story, take one, Lucia Gulugulu, a young community nurse, where? Zimbabwe, is particularly compelling. I learned from her how she was caught off guard by what at first looked like another rain, but it turned out to be Cyclone Ida. Surrounded by destruction, she set up a youth corner at her clinic as a nurse to educate patients on the links between climate disasters and health. Or another story, the 24-year-old Sidia Chusasungu in Maputo. She organized a youth movement called United for Beira to ship relief items to affected regions after road connections were lost. These are the stories of real action, real solidarity that are captured in the report. These are the actions of individuals that should inspire us all to step up today, because the window of opportunity for adaptation, the window, is closing fast. Why? Because the level of climate change in Africa in the next 10 years, taking us to 1.5 degrees, is locked in. Far more drastic cuts between now and then could enable us to hold the line at 1.5, but 1.5 is locked in. But even if the Paris Climate Agreement goals are achieved, which is not a given, the economic cost of climate change in Africa will be enormous. Africa will suffer higher GDP losses than most other regions. These impacts, these economic impacts, can only be reduced with adaptation. Africa needs to scale up adaptation now. If Africa had been prepared with resilient economies and communities to the damaging weather events of the last decade, the strong growth rates countries such as Kenya had achieved before the COVID pandemic would have been higher. But at the same time, if the Paris Agreement goals are missed, if the world warms up to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees or beyond, the economic and social costs for Africa will be catastrophic. Our analysis finds that Africa will suffer significant economic costs over the next couple of decades at several percentage points of GDP per year. But there are silver linings in that Africa has experienced less fatalities in recent years due to climate disasters. Less fatalities. However, the economic cost to Africa of climate catastrophe keeps climbing. Climate change, though, is not just about losses, but also macroeconomic risk. It will affect, and I'm sure the minister will speak to this, it will affect public finances by requiring increased public expenditure and government debt, as well as by reducing government revenues. All of this will affect fiscal stability. The risk also encompasses the private sector. Losses on assets and higher operating costs, as well as lower revenues. All this can affect and will affect, if we don't adapt, cash flow and company performance. Finally, climate change is a new and significant pressure on the sovereign credit ratings of African countries. As impacts increase, if we don't adapt effectively, these will increase the cost of borrowing, and that would reduce the continent's investment potential. And as these economic costs come from climate change, It is, again, that's my central message. It's only adaptation that can reduce them in Africa for the next decade. So let us be clear. The poor in Africa cannot afford these impacts. Why? What is certain is that climate change, it will and is disproportionately impacting the poorest and most vulnerable in Africa. Impacts within countries will be uneven, hitting the poorest and most vulnerable the hardest. In fact, worldwide, climate change, if unchecked, will push 122 million new people into extreme poverty by 2030. 122 million people. Of these, in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, 43 million new poor people pushed into poverty by climate change. And even if development is rapid and inclusive, up to 12 million people in Africa could be pushed into poverty in this time due to climate change alone. Poverty, of course, is linked, it's closely linked with security, with displacement. And half of the African countries today considered highly vulnerable to climate change, half of them are also considered fragile or even extremely fragile. And as the poor in these fragile states are hit harder, climate change will affect the security and the stability of Africa, in West Africa, by 2050. By 2050, in a worst-case scenario, we could see 50 million additional internal climate migrants. With effective adaptation, though, we can reduce that number by threefold. This is why it remains vital that adaptation efforts do not forget the most vulnerable groups. The small enterprises, business in Africa cannot afford the impacts of climate change either. All of the small and medium enterprises we interviewed in West Africa, all of them, they said they're already today affected by climate change. 70% of those we interviewed here in East Africa gave the same answer. 3/4 faced lower productivity and sales, 3/4. Half suffered physical damage to their equipment. So our report has one main message. If you read this report, you need to keep one main message in your mind. If the world stays within 1.5-degree world, if it stays within 1.5, adaptation in Africa is not only possible, we can do this, it makes imminent economic sense. It is the smartest thing to do. But we must start now, and we need to scale up fast. We have to make climate adaptation everyone's business. So the results in the State and Trends reports, they're clear. Adaptation, climate adaptation, it pays. $1 invested in weather and climate information services, $1 gives between $4 and $25 in benefits. $1 invested in resilient water and sanitation not only saves lives, it creates between $2 and $12 in benefits. African countries that invest $1 in climate-smart crops can see between $2 and $14 in benefits. Adaptation, again, the central message, makes economic sense. Well, we also looked at the other side of the coin. What are the costs of inaction? Everybody speaks about the cost of action. But what are the costs of inaction? Well, the solutions to make agriculture more resilient and better adapted to climate change, they're known. So what is the cost of adaptation of agriculture and food system in Africa? What is it? It's around $15 billion per year. So what are then the costs of inaction if we don't invest those billions? The cost of more frequent and more severe crisis response, disaster relief, recovery pathways, well, it is $200 billion a year, 13 times more. It is, in fact, inaction, not action, inaction that is expensive. So delaying adaptation action will only increase those costs. So we either delay and pay, or we take bold action now and here and we prosper. Because, let us not forget, Africa, and you know this, those here in this room, those know this, Africa is changing fast. This is an opportunity we must seize. with 43% of its population under the age of 15. 43%. Africa has the largest youth population in the world. Africa's young people today have more education than their parents do. The future of Africa's youth must not be robbed by climate change. Africa will have more than a third of the global workforce by 2040, with more than 1 billion citizens ready to work. What does Africa need? More jobs, better jobs, decent jobs, better paid jobs. And adaptation can and should be part of the solution. Africa's massive endowment of nature can be harnessed as an engine for green jobs for adaptation. African cities are changing fast too. Sub-Saharan African cities are growing the fastest in the world. About 40% of Africa's population lives in urban areas, and it will double in absolute numbers by 2050. An important challenge, though, of this number is that 60% of Africa's urban residents, 60% live in low-income, unplanned communities. About half of African cities are located in the lowest elevation coastal zones. So as sea levels rises, the risk of floods and coastal erosion that increase. So at 40% urbanization today, Africa has the advantage that most of its cities are still to be built, and they can be built resilient and adapted to a rapidly changing climate. And we have a choice here, again, to avoid the mistakes of other cities worldwide. So against this backdrop, we asked ourselves in the State and Trends report, what are the most critical foundations for a sustainable and resilient African growth? Let me start with two: infrastructure and women. First, infrastructure. Africa needs resilient and adapted infrastructure, lots of it. Many claim that resilient infrastructure is expensive and unaffordable. Well, on average, resilient infrastructure is only 3% more expensive, provided you plan it well upstream and build it flexibly. What is expensive, though, is to build and rebuild bridges and dikes after the floods. What is expensive is to face power cuts when hydropower dams dry out. Let's turn to women. Second, African countries are not capitalizing to take advantage of the unique knowledge, skills, and perspectives that women have. Women's knowledge, many of them here in this room, your knowledge about agriculture, traditional multi-cropping, livestock management is indispensable for climate adaptation, and particularly for climate-smart agriculture. African women are the true leaders in the recovery of families after disasters. African women need to be empowered to make the continent resilient and prosperous. After all, 10 years ago, Anne, when I was in Kisumu, taught this to me. African women needs to be in the driver's seat. And many positive changes are happening in all corners of the continent. But to unlock its full potential, we must have financing flow at scale. So how much is needed? How much is needed for adaptation? Based on 40 African countries that calculated their adaptation investment needs, that number is in the order of 331 billion through 2030. That's roughly 33 billion a year. So how much is coming to Africa now from the global north? About 6 billion in 2017 and 2018. So if this trend continues, Africa would just see 66 billion by 2030. But there are some bright spots. The Multilateral Development Bank, African Development Bank, World Bank, others, their finance grew from 3.6 to 4.7 billion last year versus 2019. However, in the broader perspective, this is still far short of the 331 billion. Remember that number, 331 billion, what is needed. So this adaptation investment it needs to be mobilized from a wider variety of finance sources, where the private sector is key. So we need to be focused, very focused with the limited public resources we have to orient them for maximum leverage of the private sector. The private sector generates 70% of economic output, 90% of economic growth and employment. But again, most private sector climate activities are focused on mitigation, not on adaptation. And this has to change. We are fighting, as a second key message, we are fighting a battle on two fronts. Climate change has absolutely ceased to be a question of reducing emissions alone. Addressing, particularly here in Africa, addressing growing climate impacts is as important for the world today. And at the same time, access to finance is the biggest barrier to African small and medium enterprises. This was the finding of our major GCA survey conducted with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Because adaptation is also a win-win for the private sector. It is a major business opportunity. Climate adaptation finance can also be boosted through innovative financing, leveraging pandemic stimulus financing, and focus on trade. For example, innovations in finance like climate for debt swaps that enable restructuring of debt to support resilience can unlock significant new resources for action. The huge public stimulus to COVID-19, it needs to focus as much as possible on a green and resilient recovery. And we can learn from Kenya. Kenya is a great example with some of the highest proportion of green spending in its pandemic stimulus. Other African nations would do well to follow that lead of Kenya. And finally, promoting trade, I just referenced it. Trade provides a cushion for shocks to food security, for example, or by ensuring supply of staples can meet demand when local production is hit. By leveraging comparative advantage over time, trade in resilient goods and services will also create more jobs in our economies. We need to also consider enabling conditions set by governments. All of our research shows that good climate risk and resilience data, it's vital for investments. Likewise, if we're going to increase financial flows by multiple factors, we have to build capacity of Africa, financial institutions and government entities to mobilize these resilient investments. African governments are also saying they're ready to contribute. Based on an analysis of the 15 current NDCs, the plans for Glasgow, that provide a breakdown of cost estimates, African countries are willing to put down close to 20% of funding for adaptation if the world comes forward with the rest. So if the world mobilizes 24 billion a year, 18 billion more than the 6 billion that has been coming today, African countries on average indicate that they could mobilize 6 billion a year. Because quite frankly, the Vice Chancellor, you indicated this, Africa has very little responsibility. President Kenyatta indicated this. Historically, or in the present day, for global greenhouse gas emissions compared to other major regions of the world. But will the world mobilize this funding? It was precisely this reason, with the African Development Bank, that we joined forces to design the landmark Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP. And unlike other adaptation plans in Africa, the AAAP is not only comprehensive, it also addresses the nexus between climate change and impacts, COVID-19, and the economy. So the AAAP will support all African countries in designing and implementing transformational adaptation of their economies and post-COVID recovery development pathways. What's very important, The AAAP is an Africa-owned, Africa-led response. Africa leaders have asked for this program and have endorsed this design, including an upstream facility led by the GCA, which supports investment pipeline development and other upstream work. And this is also in addition to a downstream investment facility, which is led by the African Development Bank and directly finances adaptation projects. The AAAP is the translation of the Africa Adaptation Initiative, AAI, and it translates it into actual projects and actual programs on the ground for people. This is a people agenda. So the AAAP focuses on 4 bold pillars where urgent action is needed and where investments in adaptation can yield high dividends. So a sense of scale, the program is mobilizing 25 billion in resources to support 30 million African smallholders and reduce malnutrition for at least 10 million people. It will support 1 million youth with entrepreneurship skills and job creation. The African Development Bank, under the extraordinary leadership, I have to say, of President Akin Adesina, has already committed half of the total. $12.5 billion is there. Together with all African nations, we are mobilizing the additional $12.5 billion US dollars. Because, big picture, adaptation represents only 21% of climate finance flows from developed countries to the developing world, 21% only. And the developed world committed to deliver $100 billion in balanced flows to adaptation and mitigation every year between 2020 and 2025. So the Glasgow COP, a few days from now, it must deliver on this commitment. For AAAP, what does it mean? We expect, we hope, we need 6 to 8 billion US dollars will be mobilized at COP26. And the remaining balance will be mobilized next year, COP27, at the Africa Summit. Glasgow. Glasgow must show that the world cares about Africa's adaptation. That is why we're convening, together with President Kenyatta, together with President Tshisekedi on behalf of the African Union, together with President Bongo, with all African leaders and the G20 leaders and the Nordic prime ministers. We are convening the largest ever Adaptation for Africa Summit next week, November 2nd, in Glasgow. It will showcase the continent's many solutions which are ready to scale up. But Glasgow must, in return, deliver for Africa. In closing, I want to refer back to where I began, with Akinji, Anne, in Kisumu. In her language, in your language, in Luo, Akinji, it means born in the morning. And I believe we are at the sunrise of an adaptation revolution for Africa. However, right now, today, this continent is truly at the crossroads. And adapt or die might sound too strong for some. And yet, thousands of lives, millions of livelihoods have already been sacrificed in Africa due to inadequate adaptation. But Anne, in a small village close to Kisumu, gives us hope. Because adaptation is not the right thing to do only. It is, again, the smartest thing to do. The opportunity is here, is for the taking. Let us seize it. I thank you.